All right, hi everyone. Turns out that I was the one that signed up for the first thing on the list, but I'm not the first one to post. So, because I'm a procrastinator of the highest degree. So, here we go. This is my presentation on UX versus UI. And so, I think most everyone in this class will probably already know what the acronym UX and UI already stands for, but for those that might not know, like if you're that new, so what does UX and UI even stand for? Well, UX, or sometimes it's called UE, stands for user experience, and UI stands for user interface. And probably if a lot of you out there play video games, you probably kind of understand what the difference is between those things. So like if you're playing a video game, like you're playing Mario or you're playing Call of Duty or any game, that the user experience is the moment-to-moment gameplay, what you're doing, it's what you're doing in the game and how you feel about it and all that other stuff. Whereas the UI is all the stuff in the game, like the HUD and the menu and all that other stuff. So that's probably your understanding of UX and UI. And I think almost all of us have some understanding of what of UX and UI from a technological standpoint, because we all have cell phones, we all have computers, or I hope we all have computers since we're all taking this class. But also, I like this image here of the difference between UX and UI. So like UI, at least most of the time people in the industry, when they're defining the difference between the two, is that UI is more, or let's start with UX. UX is more about what is a person's feeling about a product. How is it useful to them? What's their experience with it? And then how does their experience with it alter it? And so like we see with the user experience ketchup bottle, that it's the upside down kind because dealing with the experience of a ketchup bottle is a little different from, let's say, the functionality of a ketchup bottle, which is usually how UI is defined, is that UI is all about functionality and implementation, and then it's more about kind of getting the job done rather than necessarily caring too much about how is the person feeling that's going to use this product. It's just supposed to contain ketchup, and if you want to get it out, then you shake it. Whereas UX is like, well, let's take that experience, which no one enjoys, having a hard time getting ketchup out of the bottle, and try to improve that experience or try to reduce the amount of time people end up doing that. Though I do find myself, the thing is, the problem with the UX ketchup bottle, as soon as it's not that way, it now becomes the UI ketchup bottle. So it all depends on how the user is using it, and yeah. So let's talk a little more in depth, let's say, about, so those are sort of the general definitions of what UX and UI are, from kind of a layman's thing of, kind of divorced from, let's say a particular career. But in the industry, there's usually certain career paths you go into, usually relating to design. So you have UX designers or user experience designers, and you have UI designers or user interface designers. And so what is really the difference between the two? Is there really a difference? From the research I've done and the different sites I've been on, there seems to be this thing where they'll define what the difference is, and it almost sounds as if they've just defined exactly the same job but gave it a different name. And I have kind of my idea about why that is, but let's start with user experience design. Like, what are you probably going to be expected to do if you're a user experience designer? Well, primarily you're going to be more focused on people and their experience with a product, or what people need from a product. You care about, user analytics and what people are talking about and what they want to see from something. And from that, you have what is essentially stuff you would do in, let's say, the planning stage of your website. So like what we were doing this previous week with our site plans for our weather sites, much of the first part of that, where we're planning it out and figuring out what do we want to do here, and actually a lot of the stuff we did put in is a sort of user experience design step. is that we're site planning, we're creating site maps, we're trying to figure out what is the button path that a user of our site is going to go through when they come to our site, and what do we want them to see, and how do we want them to feel about it. And so a lot of it is that wireframing, the site planning, where people are going to go. You're researching what do people want to see from a site like this, or you're trying to figure out, well, I'm a weather site, but how am I going to set myself apart from the other weather sites? It's in, how do I want customers to interact with this, or what do I think customers want to see in this? And like what we did with our assignment, where we came up with personas and scenarios, that's about, what kind of people do we think are going to use our website? What kind of problems are we imagining that they're trying to solve with our website versus other people's websites? And then also coming up with the scenarios, what kind of issues do we want our customers to be able to solve? Now, the thing with user experience design, if we're going with, let's say you work for a really big company that can actually have a whole department that's just devoted to the user experience design side, dealing with the planning and the wireframes and just figuring out how they want the site to look and generally how they want it to function, you may not necessarily deal with much coding at all. And if you do, it's mostly about mocking it up and having more of a low resolution version of what you're going for. So kind of like what we did last week. So yeah, if let's say you really want to get into coding, maybe user experience design might not be for you, but ultimately it depends on the size of the company you end up working for. If you're working for a fairly large company, you'll probably more likely be guided towards more UI focused jobs, because that's what you're kind of being trained in. You're being trained to code, you're being trained to position things with CSS and all this other stuff, and you're dealing with JavaScript and dealing with logic, whereas user experience design purely is about the planning and figuring out how you want it to look and all that stuff. But if you end up in a more small organization, a lot of these tasks get mixed together, and that's when I think we get a lot of the sort of, I don't want to say conflict, but why this is called UX versus UI, sort of setting it up as if there's a conflict or there's some kind of confusion, which there can be a confusion between the two, but I think it's mostly to do with that a lot of times you'll end up in a small company and you're kind of wearing both hats. And so sometimes the definitions of both can blur when you're kind of both planning the site and figuring out what people want from it and also implementing it, which is sort of the main difference between user interface or user experience design and user interface design. That user interface design is all about implementation and trying to get it to work, trying to focus on the functionality of the site, get it to do the thing that the UX people said, we need this thing to be able to do this, but you have to actually implement it. You have to actually figure out, how do I get that to function in this? And so that's all about the implementation. You're also mostly into the code, which is, you're the one deciding where things go and how far apart they should be and their positioning. What color should they be? Should this be a red button or a green button? And that might be determined by whether it says yes or no. What kind of font do we want that yes to be in? Do we want it to, be in this font or that font? And so when it comes to the implementation stage of your product, the user interface designer is the one that's actually putting that in there and trying to figure that out and figure out what color should go where and trying to implement what was planned before. And so, but yeah, depending on who you work for, you'll probably be doing both things. Like what we did with this assignment last week, we kind of were wearing both hats. We were both trying to figure out the UX design part, and we were implementing it and trying to get the interface working. So yeah, and I think probably the biggest difference, like let's say if you do work in a small company and you are wearing both hats, well, what's the real difference here? I would say the biggest difference is mindset. What is it that you're actually thinking about when you're doing the design job? Are you thinking about the person that the product is for, or are you really just thinking about, you know, is this working? You know, is this thing the right color? Is it, you know, and all these things. And because sometimes people might think these are at odds, like as if the user experience people don't think too much about what's possible or how this can actually be implemented or if it's even functional at all. And then some people might think the UI people aren't really that focused on aesthetics. They're not focused on, you know, really the people at all. They care more about getting it to work and getting it to be a smooth experience. And I think really it's just about, because obviously functionality comes from, if something's functional, you'll probably have a good experience with it. And if you're having a good experience, it's probably because the thing works, it's functional, you know. So these two things come together, and it's less of a UX versus UI and more of UX and UI or whatever. But I'll go ahead and end my presentation by leaving you with some questions to ponder, and you can talk about them down in the replies to this presentation. That, you know, is there really a difference at the end of the day? And I think this might be more of a question to some people in the industry or even people outside that might be confused, but is there really a difference between UX and UI at the end of the day? And how would you define, like you personally, how would you define UX or UI? And this is more like, you know, come up with your own analogies, and they can be funny analogies and try to keep them appropriate, of course, because we're at a church school. If you already work in the industry, what is it like in your job? Let us know, you know, what it is you're doing. Maybe you can even, you know, enlighten us as to, you know, what is the difference, or, you know, what is your day-to-day like working in those fields. And for students who might not be in the industry yet, which do you think you'd prefer to do? And I think a lot of the answer to that question depends on what kind of person you are and what kind of things you want to focus on. Do you want to focus more on the people aspect and the experience, or do you want to focus more on, you know, figuring out the problem of getting it to work? All right, so that's going to be my presentation. Thank you for watching.